So, good morning from the Kulu Valley in the Himalayas. And we start our Saturday rendezvous. And why is it on a Saturday? Because we have to facilitate our scholars from around the world who are placed in a time which is very different from ours. So, thankfully, we have Danny today who is burning, almost going to burn the midnight oil from California. And we are so happy to have you, Danny. And to introduce him, Danny is an anthropological and historical archaeologist who specializes in the interdisciplinary study of literate societies. He received his Ph.D. from the University of and his MA from Leiden University. He has held postdoctoral positions at UC San Diego and Brown University. He has taught at UCLA, University of California, San Diego, and has worked as an academic director of archaeology of the Institute for Field Research, and one of the best I've seen. Personally speaking, Danny, you've been such an inspiration to me and so many others. And your lectures in my class, I just cannot forget them. And I'm so happy that you're speaking on this forum today. He has been a co-director and instructor in several research projects and field schools in Mexico and Peru. In addition, he conducted archaeological, historical, and ethnographic research in Canada, Ecuador, and Israel. His current research interests include colonialism, territoriality, mobility, social memory, and pirates. So his talk title today, I would love to know about the pirate part of it later. His talk today is about being in the realm of the three hummingbirds. This is about 2 decades of historical archaeology research in the Chontal Highlands of southern Mexico. Now, why is Danny here on the Himalayan Institute page is because he works in the Highlands. And of course, wherever we go, we need to have insights from other landscapes which are similar to the Himalayas. Every place is special. Every place gives us more insights and more ways to work with. And what is research without involving others who are working in different fields? Because when we have more brains, we have more ideas. And when we are a larger team, we work better. And this is for understanding how a historical archaeologist works in a different part of the world with kind of similar conditions. So Danny, over to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sonali, and thank you everyone really for tuning in. Again, I just kind of to echo what Sonali was just saying, we met through UCLA, through the IFR, and in fact, we do a similar type of archaeology, historical archaeology. So Sonali invited me to talk in her classes, and that's how we also got to know our respective, each other respective research better. So again, it's definitely a pleasure to be here today. And I really look forward to the discussion after my talk, your question, your comments, your ideas, because like Sonali said, this is about an exchange of ideas, and rarely we actually get to actually compare our research with such diverse areas and research opportunities across the world. So again, looking forward to the discussion. I'll try to keep it to how long do I have, Sonali?
You have about 40 to 45 minutes to talk, and at this point, I'd like everyone, including me, we'll stop our videos, we'll mute our mics, and you can share your screen. And once you're done, we will start our video screens again. And one by one, we'll raise our hands so that we can ask you questions.
Sounds great. And I'll actually also stop my video. You don't need to see me. You need to see the images. We
would love to see you. So, because your face will be shown on the side and it works well. Whatever you're comfortable with, we would like to see you.
So let me start by sharing my screen. Can you see that? Those of you who are still Sonali.
Yes, we
Can you
can.
see this? Excellent. Wonderful.
Yeah.
So let me minimize this. Okay. Okay. So again, the title of the talk that Sonali invited me to give here today is In the Realm of Three Hummingbird, 2 decades of historical archaeology research in the Chontal Highlands of southern Mexico. But before we go to Mexico, I would actually like to start with Himalayas, and specifically in the trip, I had the pleasure and privilege really of visiting the Kulu Valley in 2017, where Sonali works. And this is a view from Rajiv's cottages, in one of the cottages where I stayed, a wonderful place. And you know, to wake up every morning and look at this amazing landscape. And I must admit, this was my first time in India. So I must admit that it was all foreign to me, all new to me, all exciting, for sure. Um, but at the same time, every time, uh, for example, I woke up in the morning and looked at this landscape in front of me from Rajib's cottages, it also looked very familiar. And at first I couldn't really put my finger on it, but then I realized it's the mountains. It's really that like you see in that image, the sun kind of reflecting in the mountain and playing with all these colors and shades. And this strike is very familiar to the region in Mexico where I work. So just the geography kind of resonated with me to start with. But then when I started to learn more about what Sonali is doing there, it all kind of even more came together, the culture, the ritual, and the people and the interaction with the landscape. So again, I'll present on my research in Mexico, but I would love, again, later on, if we can talk about what is similar, what is different, etc. So let's start with kind of a quick introduction of where we are or what we're going to talk about. So again, the U.S. obviously is here. You know, I'm located right somewhere around here in Los Angeles right now, and this is Mexico. I'm not sure how well this will play on your screen, but this is something a flyover I recorded earlier on Google Earth, just to give you a sense of the landscape of that region called Oaxaca in southern Mexico. This is the state of Oaxaca. As you can see, it's very mountainous, very fragmented. The mountains are not obviously as high as the Himalayas, not even close, but still, this is one of the most mountainous regions in Mexico. And in fact, I would like to start not exactly where I work, but further down the valley. Um, this is one of the famous archaeological sites in this region in Oaxaca, in southern Mexico, and this is really the site where we have the first writing systems, recorded history anywhere in the Americas, right there in this region. And among the first inscriptions that we read, this was a literate culture. This was a culture that actually wrote their own history. Um, one of the first things that they actually recorded were these type of glyphs, hieroglyphs that you can see there on top, and these are embedded in this structure, for example. These are dated from about 100 BC. So they're just over 2,000 years old. And what we see here in all these glyphs, I know it probably looks very foreign, but we see this shape, you see this hat looking shape. Um, and this is really is a representation, symbolic representation of a mountain. Okay, so what we actually see here, for example, in this photograph in the background, is what is represented here in a glyph form, in a written form. And each one of those is actually a mountain that has a name. So for example, this will be mountain or hill of the rabbit. This will be mountain of the chili pepper. This will be mountain of the temple, etc. So they actually named the landscape using this type of writing. Um, Let me see. Okay. And the interesting thing is that in this part of Mexico, we actually see um, a continuation of this tradition of actually naming the landscape through those hieroglyphic inscription, through this type of writing. So again, this is from the 1st century BC. This is the same inscription that we saw in the site of Monte Alban. And all of these sites, in fact, if you notice in the earlier image, are located on top of mountains. So these are cities that are located on top of mountains. So they're actually naming not just mountains, they're naming locations, they're naming cities, they're naming towns. So again, this will be hill of the chili pepper, but really it's a town. And then later on, we see that this tradition, this historical tradition continues throughout all of the historical genres of the indigenous historical genres and documents. For example, these are the codices from the 15th century, and we can see those mountains here a bit more clear. These are, again, named mountains. This is Hill of the Bird. And this is a document we'll see later on. So here are those mountains again, right? This is mountain of this fruit tree. And then after the Spanish conquest in the 16th century, they changed the writing to alphabetic writing, to the one that we use today. But this hieroglyphic writing is kind of transformed into the alphabetic writing. But even there, those mountains are still being named. This is how they describe the landscape. But nevertheless, even after the Spanish conquest of the 16th century, those named mountains, those named towns are still appearing in a graphic form. So for example, this is a map from the region, I'll show it to you later on, from the region where I work, and still you can see those named mountains. And even in their oral traditions, we'll get to that later on. So what we are actually seeing is some type of a genre that I call territorial narratives. I don't want to go into this description of it, this definition. This is more again for academic purposes, and you know, it's not really necessary to go into details here. Maybe later on the discussion. But basically, what territorial narratives are, these are stories about the land. This is how they define their land and how they tell stories about it through this type of both graphic form and written form. So this is something, again, that we kind of have to acknowledge when we work in this part of Mexico, that they had this type of historical tradition. So this is where I started my first project down in this region of southern Mexico, called the Chontalpa Historical Archaeology Project. And again, historical archaeology because we have those historical documents, like I showed you earlier, but as an archaeologist, I'm also interested in the archaeological record, in the material record that people leave, and also because this is a rather isolated region, and you'll see it in a minute, a lot of this knowledge was kept in oral form. So people still tell stories which weren't written down. They still pass them orally, you know, through the generations. And we'll get to that also down the road. So we have these three very rich records. And the idea in this project was to try and bring them together. So again, this is kind of a close-up of the area where we work. This is the Pacific Ocean. This is the state of Oaxaca in southern Mexico. And this particular, and you can see also how fragmented it is, how mountainous it is. So again, not surprising that they developed this historical tradition of telling stories through those mountainous forms. Now, this area is also known for its very diverse ethno-linguistic mosaic. There are 16 ethno-linguistic groups today. In the past, there were even more. There are 300 dialects spoken just in this part of Mexico alone. It's one of the most ethno-linguistic diverse part in the world. I'm sure in India, there are probably much more diverse areas, but again, at least in the Americas, this is one of the most diverse ones. And we are going to focus today on this corner here. And we are going to look at this ethnic group called the Chontal. And today there are kind of two main dialects of the Chontal, the coastal one, obviously on the Pacific coast, and the highland one. Now, Chontal, um, the language is very interesting, in fact, because it's a linguistic isolate, meaning it's not related to anything around it. We're talking about, in the past, this whole region was called Mesoamerica. Um, and we know a lot about, you know, the languages that were spoken in this region, but Chontal, in fact, is unrelated to any of them. And in fact, even the word Chontal is not in Chontal. It's not in their language. It's in fact in a different language called Nahuatl. This is the language that the Aztec, you may have heard about the Aztecs, that the Aztecs spoke. So the Aztecs were actually conquering through this region, and they heard something they didn't really couldn't place. They were good linguists apparently, and they called them Chontal because Chontal means stranger. So they called them the strangers because they didn't know where they came from or what this language relates to. And this still baffles linguists today. In fact, there are several theories where the Chontal may have come from just by comparing their languages to other languages. So in fact, one of the still most popular theories is that they came from right around, you know, where I'm located, and Sonali, you know, was teaching and living, California. Other theories said that they came from another state, Tabasco, or from the country of Honduras or Nicaragua, or maybe even from South America, from Peru. In short, we don't really know. It's still an enigma where the Chontal really came from. Now, again, I focus most of my research, early research, on the Highland Chontal. It's still a pretty isolated region. There, those trails that, you know, you can drive with a four-wheel drive, or a kind of a rough bus ride. You'll see it in a second. But a lot of it is basically you have to walk from place to place. They still practice slash and burn agriculture. They grow mostly corn and beans and gourds. This is their basic diet. Here's a picture of basically how you get to those villages. There are some buses that get to the main villages, but then you have to walk from place to place. And again, you can get a sense of the mountainous landscape here. But again, mostly people would just walk or use mules to move, carry cargo around. This is an image of the village where we are going to focus most of the presentation today. But I just wanted to give you a sense also on how those settlements are located in the landscape. So this is one settlement. Here you can kind of barely see it. There is another settlement. Here there is another one. You can see that barely this white patch. And here there is another one. So in fact, there is a line of sight between those settlements, between those villages, Chontal villages. But obviously, in order to get, for example, from this village down here at the bottom to this one, it takes hours, sometimes even days, because you have to go up and down and cross rivers, and you know, sometimes there's a path, sometimes there isn't. So again, this is kind of the sense of what it means to actually live and work also in this type of landscape. Christianity arrived there pretty late in the 18th century. You know, in most of Mexico was conquered in the 16th century, so pretty late, which also explain why there's a lot of indigenous rituals dedicated to the mountains. I won't go over these, but maybe later on we can talk about these more, but a lot of rituals which are definitely not Christian. And a lot of the decisions are made communally. This is a communal meeting that mostly the men, unfortunately, the women are not participating as much in those meetings, decide important decision for the village. Now, the women take care of the household, they take care of the kids, but they also work in the field, and they also take care of the education. You can see also that the women are the ones who also kept the traditional dress, and they kept a lot of the traditions alive, while the men who were more mobile and left the communities oftentimes did not keep those traditions. But as I was working and getting familiar with those villages, one thing that was clear to me is that all of them have those documents still kept in the communities, in their archives, though sometimes these are maps, these are cartographic, pictographic documents that talk about the history and the territory of their village. And as I showed earlier, these are framed by mountains. This is basically the key to understand those documents. Now, this document in particular was very interesting because it talks about the history and about the kingdom of the Chontal king. And the Chontal king is named Three Hummingbird. That was his name. We won't go into how they actually name people, but this is one of the way they actually they name people in the past there. So three, not hummingbirds in fact, but Three Hummingbird, that was his name. And he's considered still by many of these Chontal people as their past king, but something of a symbol today as well. This is, in fact, the document that for me, started it all. It's called the Lienzo de Teclistán y Tecuatepec. Doesn't matter, but it was painted somewhere around 1550, so almost 500 years ago now. It was painted on a big sheet of cloth. And, you know, you can probably make out all these hieroglyphs here. And again, these are mountains. And these are representing communities and boundary markers. So they are really representing a kingdom which is bounded by mountains. And Three Hummingbird is also, his history is represented here. I did an analysis of this document, but what is interesting is that it's the complexity of all the different ethnic groups. It's not just the Chontal, it's other ethnic groups. Again, I showed you 16 ethnic groups in Oaxaca alone. So some of them are represented in this document. Zapotec, Mixtec, Pochutec, Aztec, Waves, all of these are different ethnic groups that interacted, sometimes fought, sometimes had alliances with the Chontal people. And particularly, I was interested in this community. And here again, you can see again that mountain glyph. And this is a mountain with a type of fruit tree which grows in Mexico called zapote. And so this will be hill of the zapote tree. And I was really interested in this one because um, we know where this is. This is in fact still a named community in the region. It's called Zapotitlán, which means basically the same place, the same thing, place or hill of the zapote tree. So here I already have that connection between the document and the place and the community. So I could do this type of historical archaeology that interests me so much. And even more, this place, this community, Zapotitlán, is mentioned in several of these territorial narratives and several of these documents as a very important place, as a key place to the history of the region. It's mentioned, for example, as place of the Chontal origins. Several of these documents talk about how the Chontal nation, if you will, started from this particular mountain, in fact, that you can see here in the background. They talk about the Aztec intervention. We'll get to that later on. They talk about how Zapotitlan was a subject town to another indigenous kingdom on the coast. It talks about how it was a player in factions, in fights between two heroic traditions, and I'll show it to you also later on. So in short, this was obviously a very important place in the past. So this was also a very productive place to start doing also this type of research, historical archaeological research. So again, we had this rich historical record, so we had to complement it with the archaeological survey. That's where, again, the community members stepped in. We worked together to do this type of archaeological survey that also Sonali and Parth and other maybe other people listening today are very familiar with. This is often time the first step in any archaeological work is just walking the landscape and marking all the archaeological sites. In this case, the landscape, again, as you can see, is walking on all these mountains, hills, marking all the archaeological sites. And most of them are, in fact, located on top of these mountains. Here's another Google Earth video. Again, I'm not sure how it's playing on your end, but it also gives you a sense of all these yellow names are the names of the site, the archaeological sites that we're able to identify at the end of this archaeological survey. Um, so we had about anything between 10 and 15 archaeological sites, depends how you count them. And they're all, as you can see, surrounding the community of today. Zapotitlán is located here, and all of these mountaintop locations are archaeological sites. And interestingly, this is exactly what we see in the historical record in that document that I showed you earlier. Again, this is the hill of the Zapote tree, which will be here, hill of the Zapote. But all these weird looking icons that look like almost like lampshades are in fact small neighborhoods, small subjects, satellite towns of this big site. And this is exactly what we see also in the archaeological record. So we already have a correlation between what we see in the territorial narratives of these mountainous area and what we actually can identify archaeologically. And even more, because we have the historical record, we even have a glimpse of the ruler of this town, of this place or little kingdom in the 16th century when this document was painted. He's seated here on his little throne. So the next step, again, in most archaeological projects is to start excavations. We can say that, that much from looking on the surface. We have to dig. And this is just a view of some of the archaeological excavations and sites that we're working on. Yeah, most of them located on top of the mountains, working a lot with the communities and with students and with volunteers. And each one of these sites, again, we can actually identify in the archaeological record. We have, for example, Hill of the Deer, right? So this is exactly what this place is still named today. Cerro Venado in Spanish is Hill of the Deer. So we can, again, make those correlations between the archaeological and the historical records. And we also had a surprising find while digging in the community itself, where it is located today. We found a very deep, what we call stratigraphic sequence dating as early as the 7th century AD. So this is in fact the earliest a date that we got for this region for the 7th century. So, over 1,000, almost 1,300 years ago, that we know that people lived in this location. Whether these were Chontal speakers or not, we don't know, but we definitely know that the location where the community Zapotitlán is located today was inhabited for over 1,000 years. All the analysis of the materials, for example, the ceramics, was done in the community, nothing left the community. So that was both, that helped our relations with the community. There's a sad history of colonial relations between archaeologists and the indigenous people in Mexico, as there are in India or all over the world. And the fact that we actually were able to work together with the community and do the analysis in the community helped to break those barriers, and in fact helped a lot to the archaeological analysis, because people would come to us, and for example, Daniel here and his son Marcos, they helped us a lot in the excavation. You may have seen them earlier in one of the shots, but they also helped, they came and identify a lot of these shards that we found, a lot of these ceramic pieces. They would say, yeah, my grandmother used to have exactly this type of pot, and she used it for such and such. So it really helped us, because we are not from this area. We are not familiar with this type of material culture. And in fact, the kids themselves were very helpful in the analysis as well. Um, you know, I could go for hours about what we actually found, but you know, just to highlight that some of these finds, well, some of these finds actually come from very far away. So you can see some of the finds from this particular pit, one by one excavation unit. Some of these are, actually arrive to the region from very far away, from thousands of miles away. So obviously these people were very well connected, and these go back as early. This is about 1,000 years old. This is 700 years old. This is 600 years old. So some of these go really back some time. These connections and these interactions. We also were able to do some chemical analysis. This was done outside the community, obviously, with the permission of the community. We're able to export some of the obsidian pieces. This is volcanic glass that was found in that was found in our excavation, but in fact is not found naturally in this region. And so we did some chemical analysis to these pieces. They use them as blades, as knives. And we found out, again, won't go into the details, but we found that these arrive from very far away and show that these people, the Chontal people of Zapotitlán, they were well connected, right? They actually had trade relations with people far and wide. Because this is still an isolated traditional society, in the Highlands especially, we could do a lot of ethnoarchaeology. This is, again, something that Sonali specializes in. She worked a lot in ethnoarchaeology in Egypt, but this is, again, something that we're very familiar throughout the world, that we actually go and see how people do things today, how they utilize, for example, ceramic vessels today, or build structures, and that helps us to understand also better the archaeological record. And the final element of the project was the oral knowledge. So if you remember, the project had the historical documents, the archaeological, and the oral traditions. And the oral tradition, or the oral knowledge system, is so rich in this area, again, because they're isolated, because in fact, unfortunately, a lot of them did not go to school, so they do not rely that much on written information as we are in Western culture. So a lot of the history is in fact transmitted orally from father to son, you know, through the generations. And these go back hundreds of years. It's amazing, in fact, how much you can learn from just listening to people. So we actually didn't just listen, we recorded these systematically. We have hundreds of recordings by our collaborators in several of the communities. It's a very rich culture, oral culture, that the Chontal have. Anything from place names to life histories to community histories to archaeological site history to myth historical narratives and to didactic legends. In these, for example, these two types of historical knowledge, oral knowledge, you hear a lot of stories about this king, this Chontal king, Three Hummingbird. They talk about how he came and how he helped the people and how he conquered the area and how he established his realm, his kingdom. So we have a lot of stories about uh, um, Three Hummingbird also coming from these stories. I just want to give you just a taste of what one of these genre or types of oral knowledges look like. The first one, toponymic surveys. These are place names. This is trying to identify places in the landscape. So, for example, here we are with Don Timoteo Martinez, one of our wonderful collaborators throughout the years, and we are actually doing a survey on top of archaeological site. And we're looking at this topographic map that we have that is issued by the Mexican government. And we can only, you know, if you look at the landscape in front of us, we only have these 4 locations which are marked on the map. But when we asked Don Timoteo if he knows of any other names in the landscape, that was his answer. So as you can see, this literally covers the landscape. Their knowledge of how the landscape is named, what each one of these hills is actually called, And it's not just the mountain, it's rivers and it's waterfalls and it's particular rocks. Everything has a name. And we would never get to know that if we wouldn't actually do these type of place name toponymic surveys. And this is, again, crucial to our reconstruction of the documents of these territorial narratives, because these place names are particularly mentioned in these ancient documents, historical documents that we're interested in the first place. So just even to understand that, we have to work with the people just to translate them, but also get their knowledge of their landscape. Again, I want to give you another example of these type of oral traditions. This was also one of our most close collaborator, Don Florencio Aparicio, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago. We worked with him several years, but Don Florencio Aparicio knew the landscape basically, like the palm of his hand. But also he didn't just told stories about the landscape. He also drew these type of territorial narratives. And again, you can see those mountains. This mountain, in fact, is the one that you can see here in the background. And he drew the shape of the mountains, and he told, like you see here in this other image, he told stories about that landscape to those mountains, to anyone who would listen, basically. And here I'll just, so you can hear it a bit. So this is how Chontal sounds like. I know that there was a lot of hiss in the background because we actually recorded it close to a waterfall. But this also type of territorial narratives, oral territorial narratives, um, animate the landscape. The mountains are actually alive. Here in this story, particular story, he actually talks about these particular mountains, these three mountains who are fighting, who are talking with each other first, and then they're talking, and then they're actually trying to decide who is the one mountain that brings the rain into the region. So it explains, again, meteorological phenomena, and it really, again, show how animated the Chontal landscape is actually to these people. So this is, again, once we start bringing everything together, putting the documents and the survey, archaeological survey, and those oral traditions together, we really can create what we call an inclusive historical archaeology. This is historical archaeology that includes both the people who live today in this region, and also it's also including a lot of documents, for example, that otherwise would not have been included in typical historical archaeology that mostly looks at alphabetic documents or documents that were written by, let's say, the Spanish conquistadors in this case. Okay, I just want to briefly talk about two case studies that I'm working on at the moment based on this research. One of them is those complex geopolitics that I showed you earlier on when I talked about the document, the Lienzo de Texizán y Tecuatepec, that complex document. But once we start putting all the pieces together, the history, the archaeology, and the oral tradition, we see that this region was kind of conquered by these two kingdoms, the Zapotecs from the east, the Mixtec and Pochotecs from the west. These were two indigenous kingdoms that between 14th and 16th century fought against each other. And interestingly enough, the Chontal people, the focus of our research, are located right in the buffer zone between these two competing kingdoms, which would explain also why a third indigenous group, Aztecs, you may have heard about the Aztecs, they're pretty famous, tried to conquer this region because that would allow them access to the Pacific coast. But again, when we actually start putting everything together, what we see is that the Chontal king, Three Hummingbird, there he is in one of the documents, you see him sitting on the throne, was actually fighting against the Aztec king that you can see here, also from the same document. And they were fighting against each other, and Three Hummingbird did not want Moctezuma, the Aztec emperor, to conquer the region. So there's a lot of very complex, very rich story that we are again trying to reconstruct here by looking at these two indigenous rulers. And basically what what the Aztecs were interested in, and what Three Hummingbird or the Chontal people were trying to defend, were the resources in this region. One of them is a dye which is produced from a bug, Cochineal, that grows on a cactus. So this is something that the Chontal people are very famous in. Another type of dye, purple dye, they extract from a shell that you found in the Pacific Coast. So again, people, the Aztecs were very much interested in that, and the Chontal actually had access to these type of shells and this type of dye. And gold, this is area which is still rich in gold ores. And you know, this is, for example, in one of the Aztec documents, you can see a goldsmith, and this is the glyph or the symbol for gold. And you know, we see this symbol everywhere in our regions, in our survey. So this area is still in fact rich with gold, and it's a big problem today because the mining companies, mostly foreign mining companies, are very interested in this region, obviously to mine the gold, and this causing first destruction to the site, but a lot of issues also with indigenous rights, and obviously also problems to investigators like us who are trying to access the region. We can talk about this later on. And the second case study, before I move on to the last part of the conversation, is settlement mobility. This is the case of San Miguel Ecatepec, which translates as Hill of the Wind. Again, I won't go into this very confusing map here, but what we actually realize, you know, if we go back, this settlement, Chontal village, as you can see, it's located in the mountains, but they all speak the coastal dialect. So obviously this mountainous community moved at one point from the coast up into the mountains. So we are trying to figure out why they did that. And one of the reasons, now that we know, reading their historical documents, this is one of the documents kept in the community, we know that one of the reasons they actually moved from the coast way up into the mountains is because of pirates. So here, Sonali, you wanted to know about the pirates. So there it is. Pirates, we're talking from the 16th century, 17th, 18th century, we're talking about English, Dutch, and French pirates who are arriving to these coasts and attacking all these Chontal villages and forcing them to move from the coast to the mountain. And there's still festivities that remember these pirate attacks. This is from one of the Chontal communities where they dressed what they consider as pirates, and they build a pirate ship from this cart. And this is something that we actually study ethnographically through our field school. You know, we also actually go to boat rides. This is no longer in the Highlands, obviously. This is in the Pacific Coast, but it explains why and how the Highlands were populated in the past. So this is the project that we run right now, the Pacific Rim project and field school. So I would just like to wrap this talk with a question that I don't know, maybe some of you ask yourself, you know, who cares? I know I definitely cared, you know, when I did start my research, because that started as a dissertation research, you know, so I had to, you know, kind of come up with all of this and you know, for it to make sense. But obviously, when we started doing the research, we realized that a lot of the people in the community obviously care about what we do. Not all of them, but you know, a lot of them did care about the type of research and the type of information that is gleaned through this type of interdisciplinary research. And the kids, for example, were one of the prime beneficiaries of this research. They participated almost daily. This is, for example, that excavation I showed you earlier in the village. We did it, in fact, in the court of the elementary school. So the kids helped daily with screening and analyzing the artifacts and washing them, and was a wonderful educational experience also for us, you know. We also worked with the village authorities to help and reconstruct and preserve their rich historical records. So, for example, this is an image of the village archive. Uh, when we first found it, it was in very bad shape, as you can see. But together with another institution, Mexican institution called Adabi, they came to the village and at no cost helped to reconstruct and preserve the archive for years to come, hopefully for centuries to come. There are documents here that date to the 16th century, so 500 years old. Um, Also working with another institute in Mexico helped to restore some of their documents, again, at no cost to these communities. They restored them. This, for example, one of these territorial narrative, one of these maps that talks about the territory of the village. They restore them and they bring it back to the community. And I think the greatest, probably the greatest achievement of this project was the initiation of a community museum in 2009. So it's 11 years already. And let's not go over the details, but this is basically the sign at the entrance. As you can see, they took the logo for the museum from that ancient document, 500 years old document, as the logo for the community. And this museum is still there in Zapotitlán. It has an archaeological exhibit, a historical exhibit. It's well visited. It's also served as an educational center. There are computers, there are references, books that talks about the history of the Chontal. There is a local community committee, sorry, from the village that they actually record themselves all the traditions of the community, so they won't get lost. These are just some of the activities, ethnographic activities that they themselves documented. We had nothing to do with that. You know, we were just basically admiring it. So I just like to dedicate the last 2 minutes that I have on why this is why this is important. Um, the historical identity of the Chontal people um, was unfortunately very negative. When you read the historical documents, especially written by the Spanish official who conquered this region in the 16th century, they talk about the Chontal. This is, for example, from 1580. They talk about the Chontal as dirty people with lack of comprehension. Um, they got this name on account of their stupidity. This is what the official Spanish official says. Um, they talk about them as brutish as deer. This is also from 1580. Um, Another Spanish priest talks about them as long-haired barbarians who failed to found villages and failed and so lived in narrow caves in the most hidden mountains. So we obviously were able to demonstrate through the archaeology that they had villages, they had communities, and through the historical records that they actually had a very complex community. So they definitely did not fail to found the villages. And we also actually surveyed some of those caves that the priests talk about, and we didn't find evidence that people lived there, but they did rituals there. So that's why they were considered as bad places. Unfortunately, this image was still perpetuated through the centuries up until our days. For example, this is from 1864, a very famous Mexican historian who talks about the Chontal, that in ancient times they were barbaric and cruel, uncultured, without clothes to wear, no houses, and no knowledge of their neighbors. Again, all of this we're able to disprove with this type of research. We show that they had connections with people far and wide for at least 1,000 years. And you know that their languages was savage, and again we know that it wasn't savage, it was definitely not from there, but it was in fact it's a very complex language, obviously. This is in fact a book that came in 2006 that shows this kind of primitive savage image of the Chontal people. And even in the Colony Spanish English dictionary that a lot of us in fact have in their household, and I have it here in my living room, you know, and maybe even in Mexico you can find it. If you want to learn English, you may actually open this language, this Collins dictionary. You will find, amazingly enough, you will find an entry for Chontal. But the definition is Chontal is wild, uncivilized, rebellious, unruly, coarse, rough-spoken. So again, this unfortunately is still the image out there of who the Chontal are. So we want to hope and believe that this type of research helps to rewrite this type of the right Chontal history and give our Chontal collaborators and the kids a new sense of identity. And I'll just finish with this. So what's new in the realm of three hummingbird? This is in fact something that we did last week. As you can see, this is May 30th, last Saturday. This was an invitation by the Chontal, some of the Chontal people we work with. They actually built or designed an app, an Android application to learn Chontal, to learn the Chontal language, because the language is at the point of disappearing. It's almost extinct because the kids don't learn it anymore. So they develop an app for your phone that you can actually learn Chontal, and they invited us, myself and other colleagues who work in this region, to come and speak. So now we are the one who are invited again to speak or to help them in their research, which is wonderful and exactly how it should be. And what I found interesting is that for their logo, right here, they chose an image of a hummingbird with three beaks, so basically echoing that Chontal King image, three hummingbird, even in their language learning app. So that's it. That's all what I have for you. And I'm looking forward to discussions and questions.
Thank you so much, Danny. That was, as always, an amazing lecture. I've heard it before, but each time I hear it, I gain new insights. And I'm sure there's so many, I've made a whole list of questions, but I'm going to ask my questions. I'll give the platform to others first. But I do want to say that this is such great work that you have done. And you know, especially about historical archaeology. For those of you who are new here, who do not know about historical archaeology, traditionally, they say historical archaeology starts with the Spaniards, you know, with literate societies. But that has been such a tussle within academia that historical archaeology actually has to include indigenous populations. Just because they're not illiterate in the Western way doesn't mean they are not knowledgeable and they're not literate. They are literate in their own ways. For example, how Danny described, you know, how they had this whole method of their oral narratives, their territorial narratives. And if you look at Peru, you have the Quipu knots, how they were documenting things. So they are not illiterate in our sense of the term. They're very literate people, but in a very different way. So historical archaeologists have to, and now they are including them. And when you actually talked about the Chontal's historical identity being labeled by the Spaniards as brutish as deer, it came to my mind that, you know, it actually tells you the perspective of how they look at deer, you know, and how some other community would be looking at deer. So it tells us about how they view themselves as with the world, the oppressed and the oppressors as well. And yeah, it's so important that we view the world from the point of view of the disenfranchised, how they view their world, how they map out what they see, what they know, who they are. And that's so important, and that's what you've done. It's amazing. So now let us ask questions, and I'll ask my questions at the very end. So those of you who have questions, could you please raise your hands and give a brief introduction to us so that we know who you are? Tanya, can you, I know you have a question. Mark has a question.
So I see also questions in the chat. Sorry, Sonali.
So okay. They will ask the question, and that's our chance to know them as well. So let's go with Nandini Bhattacharya. We will then have Mark after that, and then Tanya. So Nandini, please ask your question.
I think maybe they're muted.
Nandini, you're unmuted. You can ask your question.
Are you asking me?
Yes, you're Nandini Bhattacharya, right?
Yes, yes. Actually, sorry, today the connection is so bad. I couldn't hear the entire thing. Actually, I have a very larger question because I'm working on the ethnic communities in Northeast India. So I just want to ask whether author is kind of thinking about broadening the perspective in larger Europe or New Zealand to study the ethnic communities who had been conquered and whose culture had been extinct.
So let me make sure that I understood the question. So extending the scope within Mexico comparatively, or what exactly do you mean by that?
Can't hear. I can't hear.
So I'll try to answer what I think was the question. So you know, we can definitely expand the scope regionally. For example, we started working in the Highlands. Now we work in the coast. We still work with Chontal communities, but you know, you can this type of cultural richness is not specific to the Chontal people. All the other, for example, indigenous groups that I showed in Oaxaca have those archaeological sites, those historical records, and those oral traditions, and you can you know, expand infinitely, basically. But you know, there's also the methodological aspect, and that's, for example, where Sonali and I have, you know, very interesting discussions in is how you can expand this to other type of historical archaeologies, right? Or how do you redefine the field of historical archaeology, like Sonali just said, you know, by considering indigenous documents or even considering oral history. A lot of our historical archaeologists do not necessarily consider oral history, oral traditions as history. So if it's not written, then, you know, it's not there. So you can expand it also in terms of building a new methodology, new tools, and then try to apply it basically anywhere in the world, right? So, and that's where this type of exchange, again, learning from what, for example, Sonali and Parth have been doing, you know, in the Kulu Valley, how it can maybe apply to my area, or and hopefully, you know, the other way around, for example. And I hope I answered the question. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I'll take the next question from Tanya.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, that was a great talk, by the way. It was really great to learn a little more about the Chontal communities, because usually, you know, you hear a lot more about the Zapotecs and the Mixtecs. So it was great to get an insight about them. I was a little curious about the kind of ritual practices that the Chontal people have, because I know that they gave a great importance to the landscape. So how did that kind of, you know, incorporate with the kind of rituals they practiced?
Yeah. So this is a complicated and a sensitive topic in this research, because you know, I as a foreigner, as an outsider, I could come and maybe, you know, get access to archaeological sites or get access to documents, but once it actually got to the rituals, which are obviously something very private and you know, it's not something that you can access that easily. So a lot of these rituals, in fact, we got sense of only once we did those surveys on top of the mountains and we saw the remains of the rituals. And then the person who walked with us explained to us what those rituals were. Only in 2 occasions I was actually able to see the ritual as kind of unfolding, right? But the rituals is basically mostly conducted on top of the mountain. It is almost all of them are fertility rituals and have to do mostly with rain. With the rain, basically, these are these are agricultural communities, so rainfall is obviously very important to them. So these are petition for the rain gods. This is petition for the mountains. As I explained, the mountain is alive. The mountain has powers, and the mountains have the power to, for example, bring clouds. So you do the ritual on top of the mountain so it can bring the cloud, so it will rain, so it will, wet the field and they'll have what to eat. Just an example, one of the rituals is very complex one, and I was able to see one of those, is they have a very particular formulaic pattern of cutting pieces of wood. This is a very specific type of wood, and putting them in piles, numbered piles, and then burning them in a very specific sequence. It's very, very complex. But again, it's very ancient, it's very old. You can see it, you can find it in the historical documents. And they also make sacrifices, they burn eggs. And unfortunately, well, I say unfortunately again, because this is not my culture. They also conduct dog sacrifice. I'm a dog lover, I'm a dog person. So it's very hard to see it, but as an anthropologist, there's something that I have to accept. This is not my culture, this is their ritual, but they sacrifice dogs also to kind of contribute blood to as a sacrifice to the mountain.
Okay, and just to carry on that, do you think that the rituals that they practiced in the past is what somewhat remain the same, or there's been a large difference in terms of like the sacrifices you spoke about and things like that?
Yeah. That's a great question, and unfortunately one very hard to answer. We did find some evidence of similar type of rituals in the historical records that go, again, with the one with the counted sticks, the numbered sticks. This goes back 500 years. We see that in the historical records. The one with the dogs, for example, we did find dog bones in our excavations, but it's hard to know whether these were for rituals or not. Well, we did find other evidence of rituals in our excavation. Unfortunately, we don't have enough information to know really how old they are, but they're definitely not Christian rituals, right? But they also obviously evolve through time. Nothing kind of freezes in time, right? So they change, they evolve. Obviously, they're different than what they were 500 years ago, but a lot of them are still indigenous. You can definitely call them indigenous rituals and not Christian rituals.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Tanya. And I was just reminded of, when you talked about the dog sacrifice, I remember when I was an undergrad, some of my friends from Nagaland in the eastern part of the Himalayas, one of my friends came home to ask for my notes. And the next day he said, Sonali, your dog looked very delicious. And I said, stay away from my dog. And that's when I realized that having dogs is, their culture, their tradition. So, but I love my dog. So I had to keep him away. So yeah, let's take the next question from Mark Tally. Mark, over to you.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead, Mark. No, I cannot. You're muted again.
Yeah, that was a wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was wondering, is there a record of the Chontal written language as being similar to Zapotec, or is it derivative from Mayan languages?
It's unrelated. It's a linguistic isolated. It's not related to Zapotec or Maya or Mixtec or anything everything that surrounds these people today. You know, Zapotec and Mixtec, these are Otto-Mangaean languages. Maya is, you know, it's a family of its own. And the Chontal is definitely unrelated to anything around them, which again brought to all these theories of where these people came from, you know, why they're, you know, why they're speaking a language that is unrelated. So it's, I work now actually with a linguist, Aaron Sonnenschein from Cal State LA. And one of our common research question is trying to find those linguistic roots of the Chontal. And we may never find it because the origin language is also extinct, right? Whether it's Peru or maybe even, you know, the earliest connection, in fact, that people made between languages is right here in the, you know, in the region of California with the Hokan languages. But these languages, right, are no longer spoken here in California. So even that connection is very tenuous right now. But so, you know, that's kind of the $1,000,000 question, where, you know, what is that language is actually related to?
Right, that's pretty fascinating. I was wondering too, if you were using a sort of, I mean, I was thinking if they were related together, then you could sort of use a loose comparative linguistics to look at the mythologies and see if there are connections between the different mythologies. And if so, then you could infer, you could make some inference. If you don't understand the mythologies in the Chontal area, maybe you could derive some knowledge from either Maya or Zapotec.
Yeah, and in fact, there are similarities because they were still part of that Mesoamerican world, right? So we do find similarities in those oral traditions, for example, or things that we read in the documents with the Zapotecs, with the Mixtecs. So just by the fact that there were neighboring those other indigenous groups, I think, you know, there was a lot of crossover, cultural crossover, which should be expected. But again, not linguistically. So originally they probably arrived from somewhere else. That's why they're also located probably on the Pacific coast. They you know, they probably sailed to where they are right now. That's one of the theories. But then once they were there, they started making all these, you know, contacts with everyone around them. And that's, in fact, we do find, like you mentioned, these connections. Yeah.
Right, absolutely fascinating. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your question.
And also related to that, you know, Danny, here, when, you know, when we compare two very different regions, how you were talking about Chontal being a language isolate. Here too, we have a language isolate in Malana. I told you about Malana.
Yeah.
But there are similarities also because, you know, when the shamans get together, they speak a very similar dialect, and that's the world of Kulu Valley, you know, and Parvati Valley, which is Himalayan and very similar. So it's almost like a Venn diagram. There's so many similarities and there's so many differences too. And using the methodology of historical archaeology, making it all inclusive, as you said, but not only archaeology, but linguistics, art history, all these things have to come together to truly understand the true nature of things, right, of the past and the present. With that, I'll take the next question. Jenny, may I have you?
Oh, hi, Sonali. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you very much for the presentation. I was just wondering what got you interested in the area to begin with, so.
Yeah, so I was always fascinating with the archaeology and the indigenous histories of Central America and South America. So that was always kind of my focus of research. Well, not always, but, you know, definitely when I got to grad school. And it really started by accident with one of my professors, you know, as always good accidents are, with one of my professors giving me a copy of that document that I showed earlier, the very complex one with all the connection between the people, the one that was painted on a big piece of cloth. So it was reproduced in an old publication, and he gave it to me and he said, try to figure it out, let's see what comes out of it. And, now that many years later, I'm still trying to figure it out. But that kind of started a ball rolling. And once I actually got enough understanding of the document and figured where it is on the landscape, where it is on the map, that's how I got to the Chontal area and started doing all the other type of research, the archaeological and the ethnographic. So in a nutshell, that's, again, it was an accident, but a happy one. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks for that answer. I also wondered about human sacrifice. Was there any evidence of that in your findings?
So definitely not in the present, not ethnographically. There's the dog sacrifice today. In the past, there's documented evidence in the documents. They talk about human sacrifice as all Mesoamerican cultures had, but we didn't find any of that in our archaeological excavations. We only found one burial of a young girl. She wasn't sacrificed. She probably died of some illness. We didn't find any sign of sacrifice. And that skeleton, in fact, is the only Chontal skeleton we have. So we have no skeletal material from this indigenous group. Tanya, for example, earlier mentioned the Zapotecs and Mixtec. Yeah, we know a lot about them, and we have a lot of skeletal material to work with from these groups, but only one Chontal skeleton. So that skeleton, in fact, has been analyzed. We published on it. If you're interested, I can pass you the publication. So we still know very little about how those people lived and died in the past, because we have a sample of one, unfortunately. So again, not related to sacrifice, but even talking about basic skeletons, we have almost nothing to work with.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that.
Sure.
Thank you, Jenny. And I hope, Danny, you're doing good. I know it's past midnight. Would you care to go on a little while longer?
I'm game.
Okay. So the next question is from Suramya. Suramya, you can please ask your question, and then I'll take first after that.
Hi. Thank you, Sonali. Thank you, Danny, for your talk. My question is in relation to ethics and intellectual property rights. So in terms of the communities involved in your research field, what specific agreements or permissions were taken both personally as well as institutionally from UCLA in this case during the fieldwork as well as prior to publishing your research and disseminating it through other mediums? And like what kind of verifications, if there were any, which were taken back to the communities? Thank you.
That's a fantastic question. Thank you very much. Well, first, just a clarification as well. I didn't do that work from UCLA. A lot of this work was done from my home university, University of Calgary in Canada. So much of the initial process of IRB, the ethics committee approval was done through University of Calgary, and now it's done through Cal State LA, where my colleague Aaron Sunshine, the linguist, is. So this is, again, just to establish the institutional groundwork, of any ethnographic, ethical ethnographic research. But this often, the IRB, what we call here the IRB, is often meaningless to the communities we work with. Oftentimes it's kind of, to tick the box that we're doing the right thing, at least institutionally, but once we actually get to those communities, a document that we're doing it ethically is kind of meaningless. Like you alluded, it's really about intellectual property and what we actually bring back to the community, or I don't like bring back because it means we actually took it. or that it's ours. It's really how we actually collectively share the results of our research. So I'll just briefly talk about several aspects of that. One is the community museum that I mentioned at the end. Everything that resulted out of this research ended up in the museum, including the actual material culture. None of the archaeological material, again, left the community with the exception of what we needed to do lab analysis, and that was in agreement, in written agreement with the authorities of the village. For example, that obsidian that I showed you, that volcanic glass, or carbon dates. So anything that we needed to do lab analysis, they agreed to take it out and obviously bring the results back in, because often this is a distracted type of analysis. But all of the materials was kept in the community, still there. And the museum is really where all the articles, everything, all the videos, everything that comes out of this research goes into. So they always get a copy, and it goes the other way around, in fact, because the community itself is constantly being recreated, because they keep finding material, bringing artifacts, and they documenting. Now they are the one who control the museum. It's not us. So they often send me, hey, we found this, we found that, and then we kind of start having a discussion. What could it be? What time period? What culture, etc. So again, it's a very dialectical process. They share material, we share material. Because I'm in North American academia, a lot of my publication, unfortunately, well, whatever it is, fortunately or unfortunately, they are in English, which they don't read. So we try to work on translations, and everything we do, in fact, is in agreement and in collaboration with those communities. And just I'll give one more example. I showed an image very briefly of those communal assemblies, meetings that they hold. And no field season could go forward without having those meetings and then deciding first whether I can work or not. Always, you can imagine, a nerve-wracking event for us, coming to the community and ready to work, and then they're actually deciding whether we can. Luckily, no, there weren't any issues. But also, what they want actually out of the research. I can tell them I want to excavate this mountain, but they say, but this one for us is more interesting because it has more significance for whatever reason. So again, it's working with them. I no longer go much right now with those Highlands community. Now it's on the coast, so we're trying to replicate this process in the coast. And the next thing we're actually thinking, again, in the spirit of the times, is actually building a virtual museum. And that will bring a whole new set of ideas and questions and interesting processes to the question also of intellectual property, also who can access this virtual space, because the physical space in the village, only if you travel there you can get there, but a virtual space anyone can access unless you set up certain barriers. So again, that is a whole new frontier for everyone. But it's always on the front of our research and our minds. And again, it's not us and them. We work together. We have collaborators. And like I showed in the last example, they invite us now to actually participate in their research rather than the other way around. So I want to believe that it's ethical, that it's collaborative, and that nobody is reproducing those colonial structures that are so familiar, unfortunately, still in archaeology.
Thank you for your efforts in bridging those gaps which exist in academic anthropology and archaeology in general. And I think there is certainly that gap in terms of, say, the official correspondence with the universities and institutions and the ground realities. Thank you. We have to take a lot of learnings from your experience and try to do the same in different geographical space. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your comment and question.
Thanks, so Ramya. And just adding a little bit to that, like what Danny said, that for them, these review board permissions mean nothing. In fact, when I was working in Egypt with the potters, and I was trying to explain to the IRB that, if I take these consent forms to them and they're not educated and I tell them, sign them or put your thumbprint, they'll think that they're selling their property off to me. So I said, I cannot do that. And I would read them out in Arabic, but, my consent would be verbal consent. I would take it on camera, and some of them just refused, and some of them just wanted to tell me everything. And here in the mountains, in the Himalayas, I would like to ask Dr. Anjali whether in anthropology there are, in India, do we have to take certain permissions here? And here too, especially, and ma'am, before you answer that, I sometimes face this thing where customary law, it takes precedence over, things that may be unconstitutional. But I have to be so careful, because if I ask the wrong, if I ask them and they're forced to say something that is not right constitutionally, they can actually ostracize me, because now I'm a part of the community. They know I'm working here and I cannot cross the lines. I have to respect them. And that's where being an anthropological archaeologist becomes difficult, because you have to walk on a very fine line. You cannot upset one or the other. You have to be objective. You cannot be an activist. You cannot feel disdain or feel bad about things, because your own education teaches you that. You are thrust with so many of these conflicts yourself, and that you have to navigate through them. And I'm sure, Danny, you must have faced so much, like the dog sacrifice itself. You love dogs, but you have to be objective. So, Dr. Anjali, could you tell us about, yeah, go ahead.
No, I'll just maybe quickly follow up on that, and also going back to the question about rituals. I think it's very naive, and Sonali kind of alluded to that, very naive to think of the community as something homogeneous, right? And in our case, we have a lot of religious divisions within the community. Even in that community, Zapotitlán, where I worked, we had, you have Catholics, you have evangelicals, and you have Jehovah's Witnesses. And there's a lot of internal conflicts in the community. So for example, those people who conduct the rituals on the mountains, what Tanya was asking earlier, are in fact only the Catholics. These are not Catholic rituals, but only them would actually do it. The Jehovah's Witnesses, in fact, will consider it as a taboo. So if I'm interested in that, just by the fact that I'm interested in that, I'm already alienating, the Jehovah's Witnesses. So it's, again, a very delicate balance, and you have to find, you have to improvise a lot. You have to find solutions. But obviously, this is part of what it means to actually work in these places. Yeah.
Right, Danny. Thanks for that. And I think Dr. Anjali had to leave, so I'll ask that question later. Parth, thanks for waiting for so long. Can you please ask your question?
Yes, that was a very insightful talk. I learned a lot. Thank you very much, Dan. I have two questions. One is, are there any archaeological sites in the valleys or on the valley floors? And if so, how are they functionally and archaeologically different from the hilltop sites?
Yeah, so that's another great question. What we consider, we don't have valleys that close to where I am. So it's either mountains or coast. And the valleys, obviously there are valleys in southern Mexico, but they're not close enough to my area. So I can definitely talk about the connection between the coastal sites and the highland ones. These are dating to the same time periods. So they're occupied, from starting, let's say 5,000 BC and, up to the present. And also we think by the same people, because the material culture generally is pretty much the same, but because even at short geographical distances, we're talking about very distinct ecological niches between highland economy and coastal economy. Then the type of resources and economic exploitation that they're conducting is different. But the interesting thing is obviously the exchange. Okay, so we find coastal materials up in the highlands and highland materials down in the coast. So obviously, these communities exchange these type of different materials. Now, what we see ethnographically today, and that kind of goes back to the research of settlement mobility that I talked about, is that sometimes communities, the same community will actually break in two. We have this recorded ethnographically for the last 50 years, and part of the community will go and establish a colony on the coast or in one of those Piedmont valley-like areas. But the nuclear community will stay on the highlands, particularly for the purpose of exploiting these different ecological niches and create those networks of exchange. So again, they could look very similar, but the same, different maybe in terms of environment, but at the same time, they're part of the same network. So I hope that answered a bit your question.
Yes, it did. Thank you. And my second question is about the oral narratives. Are they still being passed on, or are they in danger due to the younger generation leaving for education, for jobs, or other reasons?
That's unfortunately is an easy answer. They're in danger. They're almost gone. Like with the language, they're almost gone with the language. It's a process that started in the 1960s, where the Mexican educational system was trying to homogenize the indigenous population and force them to speak Spanish at the expense of their indigenous traditions. And this is indigenous languages. And this is also where a lot of these oral traditions started to disappear. But it accelerated, in the recent decades with globalization, with understandably the younger generations, they're exposed, to Western culture. They want to go and study outside, like you mentioned. And these stories are no longer passed. So we definitely could record hundreds of stories with the elders, quite a few with the adults, and with the kids, almost nothing. So part of that, for example, that phone app that they developed to learn the language, hopefully will have other elements down the line. I mean, they just launched it, right, last Saturday. So, but down the line, they hope to add other elements like stories, like these type of traditions. So you can actually hear those type of stories. Let's say the story of the Chontal King, 3 hummingbird, narrated in Chontal from one of the elders, and that will help it to pass it down to generations. It's anyone's guess, really, what if Chontal, in fact, will still be spoken in the next 20 years. It's that bad. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Danny, I have a question. It relates to one of your slides where you're showing pottery making. One of the ladies is holding a pot with several holes. What is that vessel used for?
So maybe let me just pull it up really quickly so we can all be on the same slide, as it were. Yeah, so there it is. So these, this one, right?
Yeah.
Can you see? Yeah. Yeah, so this is for screening, for washing maize, for washing corn. So they would put the corn kernels and they would wash it, and they would also put lime in it. The lime helps to break the corn later on when they cook it. So it's part of the cooking process, basically, of the processing of corn. They also use it, as a strainer like any other strainer we have in our, in our kitchens. But this is a very old vessel form in this region. We find it, dating, I think, back, 1,000 years ago, and it looks almost identical, right? And they're still making it. So, maybe even this one will end up, one of those pichanchas. They call pichanchas. She'll just finish it and then she'll poke the holes in it. So yeah, so again, if we just found it in the archaeological record, we wouldn't necessarily know what it is, but comparing it again to modern cases, it doesn't prove that this is how it was in the past, but it gives us a good idea of how it could have been used.
Do they have it in varying shapes and sizes? And why I ask this is because too far-fetched, but very far off the time period. In the Indus Valley, you do have miniature versions of this and in different sizes, jars, with these holes without soot marks. So they're very small, they come in varying sizes, and we really don't know what they were used for. So when I saw this, it was very, very interesting for me to see. And that's how it
Yes.
helps us seeing things from different cultures and
Yeah,
trying to
and these
understand.
would not have soot marks either because they're not cooking in them, right? They're just washing things. So, they didn't have obviously corn in the Indus Valley, but maybe other type of grains that they needed to kind of process by washing.
Yeah, but they have it in like very smaller versions too.
Uh-huh.
So I'll send you some examples,
Yeah,
photographs.
absolutely. Would love to see that. Yeah.
You can have a look. And let's see, we have a question on, okay, so I'll take Jenny's question first, and then so Ramya has a question again.
Hi again, Danny. I was wondering whether you came across medicinal plants, and are they still being used today from the time that you started studying the region? And could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it wasn't my research focus. So I personally wasn't looking for those, but interestingly enough, once we started working on the museum, especially with the committee, the local committee, they decided one of the projects that they want to exhibit in the museum is medicinal plants. So they work with the local shaman, if you will, one of the curanderos, one of the people who heal, a healer, and they documented all the medicinal plants around the community and how they're being used, etc. So again, I didn't know anything about it, but I learned a lot from their research because they actually did a very systematic documentation on where these plants located and what they're used for. So again, it's one of the slides there. In fact, show them making a cream for cuts out of one of these plants. But I'm sure you can guess that they have medicinal plants for everything, really, from headaches to stomachache to they can cure everything with plants. But like everything else, like Parth asked, this knowledge is disappearing. So this is also type of oral knowledge, and I don't know of any kids today, for example, in the community who are interested in that type of indigenous knowledge. So yeah, it's whatever is documented, but I'm sure there's a lot that is just going to unfortunately be lost if nobody will work on that.
Okay, great. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Jenny. And so Ramya has a question about cultural adaptation. So Ramya.
Hi. So my question stems out from my observation that globally there is like an increasing interest in preservation of cultures, especially indigenous cultures, right? So, but it takes me to the fact that a lot of the times these are coming from an external agency and not from what people really want, because in order to sustain a livelihood in their specific geographies, right? Is it something coming out of their choice that they would want to hold on to certain aspects and let go? And then if I take it to the case study of, say, the mobile app, for example, I might be mistaken, but is it something of an external revitalization project, or did it come out of the community's need to maintain their linguistic affiliations? Thank you.
Yeah. Again, that's an excellent question, which unfortunately I'm not capable of answering really, because I'm not, you know, it would have been great, you know, and I should have again invited my collaborators in the Chontal area, but really for them it's really like 2 a.m. right now. But uh, you know, I can only speak to what I witnessed. And you're right that there is always this conflict between, you know, what we perceive as indigenous knowledge or what is important and what they actually perceive. Um, in the case of the app, it was I'm actually I can say with certainty that it was definitely their initiative. Two people, specifically two women in the community, in one of the communities that we work with. We collaborated with them many years ago, but they are very much interested in that. Um, one of them, Roselia, who was really the driving force between the idea. Um, you know, I like my title, the title of the talk suggests, I've been working in this community for 20 years, or in this region. I saw her, you know, growing up from little, like a child, and now she's actually she's pursuing her Ph.D. in linguistics in one of the universities in Mexico. But she never forgot her roots, and she's very much interested in the language. Her grandfathers used to talk to her in Chontal, not so much her parents. So for her, that was a mission, basically, to do that app. And, you know, we welcome it. We help in whatever, obviously, however we can. But it's not really up to us to push it or to insist that it will succeed. It's really up to them. I mean, we cannot, the language can only preserve if the Chontal people want to speak it, right? We cannot really force it on anyone. So again, it's a great question, but you know, again, unfortunately, I don't think you know, I'm privileged to answer it fully. So I'll leave it at that.
No
And
worries. The dialogue which needs to be kept moving forward to actually, you know, be more reflexive and be more considerate in future uh, investigations, I guess. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Suramya, you know, just yesterday or some days back, Rajiv and Danny, you know, you've been here. Rajiv and I were talking. I was asking Rajiv whether his kids know the local dialect. In fact, you know, the local dialect is one thing, and if, there is another sub-dialect which is spoken among the for rituals and all, which the younger generation is not aware of. So I was talking to Rajiv. I said, Rajiv, we need to make sure that the younger generation speak this, because if they stop understanding what the gods have to say through their mouthpieces, this tradition will die. Nobody will understand it. So it's very important for us to document it as academics, and for the people here to understand that this needs to go on. The transmission cannot be stopped, because we lose out. Like you said, Chontal is becoming a very, it's almost to the point of extinction, and maybe this app helps. So we all need to think about, you know, where we are working and what we can do to preserve that. And of course, external changes affect these regions, and nobody is immune to that, like nobody is immune to the coronavirus, right? Everybody is suffering. So we all have to make this effort together, that we preserve these things, both, you know, in our own families, you know, languages we speak, our kids speak, those who do not have kids, you know, even for them to think about ways that we can preserve all of these things. So I'm glad that Chontal has made a step towards that, right? And Danny, you're happy with that, right?
Absolutely. I mean, we're thrilled again just to get the invitation to participate. They like yourselves. They actually have a WhatsApp group, and I'm not very good with this group. So Nali already, told you that I don't. I'm the last person on earth that doesn't have Facebook, or there is a page somewhere, but I never looked at it. But it's amazing. Again, when I arrived to this region, people did not have cell phones, did not, there was one TV maybe in each one of the communities. And now it's completely different. The young generations, they're as mobile savvy as any of us. And you have to do with the tools that you have, right? So it made sense to build that app on a phone. Whether it's actually going to work, I don't know. I hope. Chontal is the most endangered language in Oaxaca right now from all the 16 languages. So if it doesn't work, then again, the language unfortunately will die. But this is not, again, this is like Suraima said, Suraimya, that it's not really up to us, right? It's up to them. I cannot force anyone to speak the language. I'm very much would love to see it continuing and also helping us academically. But if people decide that they don't want to speak Chontal anymore, and then now they want to learn English so they can come to the States and work, I don't know, because a lot of them do that, then that's their decision.
Right. So, Parth, you have a question. I see your hand raised, and then we have Nandini. And after that, Danny, we'll let you sleep.
I'm good, but yeah, I understand.
Parth, you have a question, or was your hand not lowered since you last asked a question? Am I mistaken? Okay. No, he doesn't. He messaged me. No worries, Parth. So, Nandini, you had something to ask?
Yes. No.
Yeah, Nandini, we are waiting.
There is can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah. So the similarity in the name is very intriguing, and Santals were a nomadic community, and the origin and the migration myth is in the it is not very clear. This is just one point I want to, I just pointed out. Secondly, in Eastern Himalayan region, all of such communities, there were 22 communities, they lost their culture, language, rituals, and everything. And for whatever reasons, political, ethnic, they are trying to revive it. They are trying to revive their rituals, they are trying to revive their language, and in the process, there is a kind of invented tradition. I could not hear, I'm sorry because of the bad connection in Kolkata. Is there anything like that, in the process of revival, there are some inventions in the process?
Well, that's a good question, but it's not really my research focus. What we really need is a thorough anthropological research in the region. I conduct this type of research. This is a wonderful anthropological question, and I usually conduct my anthropological research mostly as it relates to archaeology, and only those aspects that have to do with, again, the historical or archaeological region. There's still, I really don't know so much about the contemporary cultural practices, like you say, the cultural inventions and revitalization and things like that. We need to send like an army of students and scholars, and conduct serious ethnographic work on these questions. So unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you. I can, just kind of
Well,
think of
thank
a
you
few
very much.
example, but that again, that shows that there's so much to do there. There's, just
Yeah.
hearing those questions today, it it is clear that there's interest, and we have so much to learn from by conducting research in this region. So I hope to come back, if not this summer, because of the situation of the pandemic. Hopefully next summer we'll come back with more students. But I welcome also any of you. If you're thinking of a trip down to Mexico, um, don't just try to go to the Chontal area because it's not very accessible. You can, but it's better if anyone is actually interested, you can contact me through Sonali. She has my email. I'm happy to answer any emails, any questions you
Yeah,
can.
I would love to have your contact number, actually, the mail ID.
Sure. Yeah. Sonali, feel free to put it in the group
Yeah, Sonali
for
can
anyone.
give it to me. Yeah,
I'll do
quite
that for sure.
interesting.
Yes, I'll do that. And Jenny has messaged me. She said, I really have this last question to ask. So please take her
I'm
last.
no problem. I'm actually very much awake, so no problem. Yeah.
Okay,
Hi,
go ahead, Jenny.
hi, Danny. Thank you for indulging me at this last minute. You said that you spent 20 years in the region on a personal level. What is it what did it bring you personally? Did you bond with the people? What particular part of Chantal basically have you left your heart there, or what is the situation?
Wow. That's a great last question. Or maybe it's not the last, but it's a great question anyway. The obviously you form a lot of friendships. I mean, all of us who conduct this type of anthropological, archaeological research, they know that you get very close to the people. Um, I can tell you that it took some time to gain trust. Um, Coming as a foreigner, a white man, that have a lot of this, again, colonial baggage with work in the indigenous communities. It wasn't easy, so it took a lot of time to forge these trust, and you can still feel it when you go to a new community. Now that we're expanding to other communities, there's still a lot of mistrust, but it's easier because you already come with that history of, hey, we worked in that community. If you don't believe us, go and ask them, or go and see the museum, and then that already is kind of creating kind of a baseline, which is easier. But to go back to your question, I it's hard to really pinpoint exactly what I left in each one of the communities, but definitely Zapotitlán, that community that I showed, that I talked about today, is the one that I worked at most. And it's almost like going to a second home, because or third home, or whatever it is. I worked there 10 summers in a row. I had my room there. They actually wanted to marry me, to their daughters, and give me a piece of land, to plant my corn. I kept telling them that I'm married, and I kind of gently rejected their offers. But again, you kind of brought into the family, and this is exactly the type of experiences that that is part of the part of the experience of conducting research. And now I also want to add this. Now that we work in the coast, it's a different type of mentality. They're not so isolated like the Highland people. They're more used to foreigners and tourists and things like that. Um, so it's different dynamics. I can definitely say that I'm more connected, um, emotionally at least, to the Highlands people than I am with the coast, although I already worked for several years on the coast. So yeah, for whatever that's worth. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jenny. And any more questions here? God, there was something on my mind, and I've totally blanked out. That
You can
happens
ask
sometimes.
me. You can ask me later also, Sonali.
I can ask you later, but I do want to thank Danny for such a fascinating talk and for keeping you awake for so long. Thank you. I owe it to you. And of course, I need to
Really.
make another announcement. And Danny, you're invited. We'll have. Let me take it out lest I say the wrong title. We will have Ian Baker next Sunday at 4 p.m. Talk about the geography of Shangri-La. A lot of you are aware of Shangri-La, made famous by the Hollywood film The Lost Horizon. And a lot of books have been written about it. It's also known as Shambhala. So he'll be talking about the geography of Shangri-La, terrestrial pure lands in Tibetan Buddhism. And of course, Ian Baker has been funded by the National Geographic Society as one of the 7 explorers of the millennium. So, of course, you need to hear him as well. He's a scholar of Tibetan Buddhism and an anthropologist. So, all of you do come back next week on 21st. And before that, right tomorrow, we'll be talking about intangible cultural heritage, where a father and daughter duo of the Dilli Gharana, which is a very old school of music that dates to about the 12th century or even earlier, dating back to the early times of Nizamuddin Aulia, Sufism, the Sufi order. They will be talking about the importance of gods and goddesses, Hindu gods and goddesses in the Indian ragas. And it really fascinates me that where we talk about divisive cultures and religions, here we have a school of music where the doyen of the school of music is Muslim, the whole family is Muslim, and they sing these classical ragas in ode to Hindu gods and goddesses. Like, how lovely is that, and how did that happen? So they will be talking about that tomorrow at 4 p.m. So please join us and spread the word. And Danny, thank you so much. And stay safe and come back to the Himalayas, to the Highlands of India, right? And yeah, thanks so much. This gives us great insights.
Well, again, same here, just the discussion, the questions, and I really, again, want to thank you all, Sonali and all, for this invitation to share some of this research. Feel free again to contact me if you have any other questions or comments or insights or comparatives, anything. I mean, again, this was delightful, and obviously now we have to do it virtually, but soon enough we'll be out of this mess and we'll be able to hopefully do it in person, either in India or in LA or in Mexico. So, but thank you again all for coming.
Chontal colleagues, we loved knowing about them and that they live on in our memory as well. It's so important to acknowledge the indigenous people and that they are known in India as well. And I will be sending you the chat text of our session today, because there are certain compliments that you've received and some questions that you can follow over. And I will be uploading this talk on our YouTube channel, the Himalayan Institute of Cultural and Heritage Studies. So you will be all over social media. Even if you're not there, you'll still be there, footprints. So thank you for allowing us, and have a great night. And yeah, take care, Danny.
Well, thank you, and thanks everyone again, and yeah, stay safe wherever you are.
Yeah, and Rajiv, want to say bye?
Bye.
Bye, Rajiv. Bye, my friend. I hope to see you soon. Go back to the cottages.
So great, and Pars and I look forward for our second session tomorrow I hope you can join it. It'll be very early for you, Danny, but try if you can join it. Okay?
Yeah, I'm still in the group, so again, send me everything, and I'll definitely try to tune in.
Great. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye bye.